Hello and welcome to Field Study, an exploration of food and the landscape. It's a glorious February day and my village has been shrouded in mist for about 3 days now, and it's just starting to lift. So today we're going on a plant walk from my village down towards the coast, and we're going to be exploring some of the things that are growing now, both edible and inedible. It's a very interesting time of year. We've got lots of fresh new growth coming out on the ground, and we've got loads of things that you might not be able to see otherwise. So yeah, come with me and let's go look at some plants. So here in my village on the south coast of the Isle of Wight, we are prone to mists. And like I say, this mist that we've got today has been with us for the last 3 days. And it sort of blows and gets thicker and then thinner, and you can see the hills and then they disappear. It really is quite atmospheric. I want to use today as an opportunity to teach you guys about how understanding the landscape as a whole and the different constituent parts of it can help you be more successful as a forager and increase your harvests and just make you more aware of the overall landscape and the ecosystem. Because once you find out about different habitats and what different plants like, you are more likely to be able to sense and hone in on where they might be. Now, the first thing I want to explore today is geology, and the geology of a place will affect the things that can grow there. So if you think about geology as being the bedrock of a sort of chain of species that then exist in a place. Now here we're on the coast, and I'm standing on top of what is a huge vertical green sand limestone cliff. Now that means all of the soil around here is sort of limestone soil, so it's slightly alkali, and that is fantastic for lots of our native deciduous plants. So here you won't find things such as conifer forests and things like blueberries and heathland. So understanding how geology affects the acidity of the soil is the first step to understanding what sort of plants will exist in a place. Now from the soil up, the other thing that dictates the plants and when and where they will sort of pop up and spring up is the climate. Now, we're right on the edge of the coast. It's very difficult not to be on the edge of the coast on the Isle of Wight. It's a very small island, a postage stamp in the English Channel. But I can actually hear the sea to my left-hand side and I can see the village there. So coastal areas, as a rule of thumb, are usually a little bit warmer than areas inland or at high altitude. So we down here are usually about 2 degrees warmer than everywhere else. But, and this is where geology comes back into it. So the village exists on 2 levels that are split by this huge limestone cliff. Now this limestone cliff does 2 things. It shelters on one side from the prevailing southwesterly wind. It also reflects and absorbs the heat of the sun. So during the day, it's always warmer down there than it will be up here, even in the winter. So you can have a heavy frost up here, and down there it can be beautifully warm. And it really is quite a strange thing when you walk down the footpath. You can almost feel the temperature change sometimes. That limestone cliff also absorbs some of the heat from the sun and the sunlight during the day and then irradiates it out at night. So not only is it warmer during the daytime, it doesn't suffer from the fluctuations of temperature that the rest of the island does. And because of this, it's a very interesting habitat. Now, if you couple this with the mists that we get and that lingering moisture in the air in the spring and the autumn, and you get an incredible place for things to grow. Life exists here in great profusion. We are very, very biodiverse down here, and it shows absolutely everywhere. And I feel it when I go to other places, even places which people describe as nature reserves and things. Having grown up here, I can see that there is something lacking there elsewhere. And I want to show you just some of the things that make this place so rich. So as the mists push in, they get pushed up against these huge limestone cliffs. And at this time of year, when there are no leaves on the trees, the droplets condense on the branches and make these little moist habitats, which are really, really rich in lichens and epiphytic species like polypody ferns. And because it's so sheltered down there, the trees grow incredibly tall, which makes these huge, over 50-foot towers of lichen, these huge pillars of biodiversity in the landscape. They're almost like deep sea vents or coral reefs, in my opinion, and they are beautiful things. Now, because it's the middle of winter and there are no leaves on the trees, if we look down here from the top of the cliff, we can see just how much lichen there is growing on the limbs. It's this sort of pale emerald green and makes the trees look like these giants covered in green fur. And you can really pick it out against the mist. Now, the term lichen is a little bit of a confusing term because a lichen isn't an organism of itself. By which I mean lichen is actually a word that describes the relationship between two organisms that live symbiotically. So a lichen like we see here growing on this blackthorn on the edge of the cliff is actually two organisms. So at its base it is a fungus. So the thing that gives it its lovely structure and form, all these hair-like structures or leaf-like structures, the bits that look like little trumpets or stag's horns, all of these different shapes and things are governed by a fungus. Now the other thing that forms a lichen is an algae. So on top of the fungus, an algae will attach itself. So this is a two-way symbiotic relationship. So the algae on the outside of the lichen will photosynthesize and make energy from the sunlight, and it will give some of that energy to the fungus. Happy fungus. Now in return, the fungus attaches itself to trees in moist places like this, and it will create structure and create a perfect place for the algae to live and bloom. Now the two things can't exist without each other, which is a beautiful thing, and that process is called lichenization. The two organisms have lichenized to form a thing that acts as a single organism, but in reality, genetically is two. So certain lichens are what's known as an indicator species, and they aren't very tolerant of pollutants in the environment. So by checking the diversity of the lichens that you have in a habitat, you can sort of get an understanding of how healthy it is as an ecosystem. We're very lucky here, we have excellent air quality. The nearest cities are to our north, and the prevailing wind comes from the southwest, so blows all of that sort of thing away. And the nearest road down there on the undercliff, the lower part of the village, fell away in a landslip years and years ago. So it's mainly only open to foot traffic and the few houses that are down there. So there isn't that much car traffic, which means that it doesn't have a lot of lead pollution and fumes and stuff going into the environment. So because of that, we have a huge surge and regeneration of lots of different species. And I really hope that I can show you some of those species as we go along through the year and as they poke their heads up. It's a very special place, not only to me, and I believe that it should be studied more widely. Now, it's actually quite strange. If you look at the blackthorn that this lichen's growing on, it's actually coming into blossom. So the other name for blackthorn is Mayflower, and that's because the blossom usually comes out in May, late April, early May. So you can sort of see what effect the microclimate has down here. These are incredibly early. So it's really interesting. If you look at all of these little nodules along the stem, these are all flowers that are ready to burst open. It's really quite a spectacle down here when all of the blackthorn comes out in blossom, because all of these hedges along the edge of this cliff go bright white and frothy. And if you look from a distance, it almost looks like someone's pipe dicing along the edge of a cake. And the whole thing is just alive with bees and flying insects. It really is lovely. Look, we can even see the little leaf buds starting to come out on here. So the blackthorn is a prunus, so it's in the same family as plums and damsons and cherries, otherwise known as stone fruit. And later on in the year, it will give us sloes. Now, sloes are those tannic, bitter, mouth-puckeringly dry fruit. Now, if we look here, we can actually see the thorns that give blackthorn its name, and they are huge. Now, the current thinking is that this plant evolved when Europe was populated by herds of straight-tusked elephants and rhinoceros. And because of these large grazing animals, it evolved these huge spikes to be able to pierce through the thick armoured skin of them. And it's very interesting, the more this plant is damaged, the more spikes it will put out. which is an adaptation which we also see in plants such as holly. The more that holly is grazed by things like deer, the more spiky the leaves will be. So because of the rigidity of these spikes and their strength, our ancestors used to use them as fishing hooks, what are known as gorge hooks. So in the middle they would have tied their line, which would have been made out of nettle fibres or potentially burdock. Now when the fish swallowed the worm whole down into its gut, the thorn would then turn sideways and catch the fish by impaling it on its inside, which is a very effective, if not barbaric, way of fishing. So I wouldn't recommend trying it. It's one of them primitive skills that is interesting to learn about, but maybe not replicate. Now there are certain lichens that people deem to be forageable, especially one called oak moss. If you read John Wright's fantastic book, The Forager's Calendar, he puts it in there, and what it's used for is its aroma. When you heat it up, it smells like perfume. I think he describes it as it smells like the perfume floor in Debenhams or something like that. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it has that much of a justifiable culinary use in order to be able to pick it in any profusion. And it is such a slow growing thing and an integral part of the ecosystem that I don't tend to forage for lichens. They're not particularly nutritious unless you're a reindeer. So just on the edge of this footpath here, I found a very interesting little plant. And it is this. This is a type of Speedwell, and I've actually got this growing in my garden. I think this is potentially ivy leaves Speedwell by the shape of its leaves. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this home and I'm going to have a little look in my books and see if I can identify it further. So a relative of this plant called Speedwell is actually an incredibly good edible plant. Now it was used to make a tea back in Victorian times and was so popular that all of the patches and fields that it used to grow in around London were stripped bare, and it was sort of extinct in that area of the country because there was such a demand for it in the city to make this tea. Now I'm not sure whether they thought it had health-giving properties or whether it just tasted good. I haven't really tried it myself, but that is one to try later on in the year. But yeah, it's very interesting from a historic point of view. Now we come to one of my favourite trees ever, and it's regarded by many as a weed, and maybe that's why I love it so much, but this is elder. And we see the first leaves are just starting to appear on it. But if we look down here, we can see its buds like this. So the interesting thing about these is this lovely burgundy colour, this sort of deep wine red. And this is caused by something called anthocyanin. Now anthocyanin is basically a plant sunscreen. So what it's doing here is protecting these really, really tender little leaf buds from any UV radiation that they might get when they're young that could damage them and stunt their growth. Now there's no chance of that today because it's so cloudy and misty. So this pigment, this plant sunblock, is common in lots of different plants. You'll see it when roses start to bud, and other members of the rose family like brambles sometimes do it as well. And they'll have this beautiful red colour before they eventually turn green when all the chlorophyll comes into the leaf. So yeah, that's really, really good to see. Elder is such a good tree to know at this time of year because it gives us our wood ear mushrooms. Now the wood ear mushroom lasts all the way through the winter, can survive snow and frost and deep freezes. So when there's not really that much else out there, you can always find wood ears somewhere. And they mainly in this country grow on elder trees like this. Now the elder, it's said to look old before its time, and you can see this gnarled bark that it has, even for a relatively young tree. So it has lots of sort of rough divots in the bark. It looks really, really gnarly. And here, that gnarly bark, mixed with the mists and the microclimate and all the things that we talked about before, means that it's covered in this beautiful, beautiful green lichen. And I really can't do it justice with this camera, but it is like a very lovely pale yellow. So the tree really, really shines out a lovely yellow-green against the backdrop of browns and dark muddy colours at this time of year. So it really is quite a welcome sight. Now this is turning into a bit of a theme today. I was just having a closer look at this elder, and if we look on one of these branches, this is one of the ones next to the path, we can see that not only has it put a few leaflets out, but it's also trying to flower. Now that is a little elderflower bud in the middle, which is worrying and fascinating. Usually elder is sort of an early summer flower. Now the tree must have been quite happy with the conditions that it's been given this year in order to waste energy trying to flower in the middle of February. Absolutely insane. Such a bizarre thing to see. Now this next plant that we have behind me is quite interesting, very common, lots of you will know it. It is ivy. And in America you guys call it English ivy, thank you very much. But it isn't just English, it grows absolutely everywhere. Now ivy is not an edible plant, I want to stress that to you now. It contains saponins, which are toxic to human beings. But those saponins are quite interesting. So because of the saponin content, saponins are also antimicrobial. So that means that this can be used as a soap in order to clean things. And there are hundreds of videos on the internet teaching you how to make ivy soap, and they're very, very useful. And it makes a lovely gentle detergent, so if you've got sensitive skin and stuff like that, it is quite good for it, and it doesn't have any harsh chemicals in it, which is lovely. Now the interesting thing for me about ivy is the way that it grows, and luckily here on this ash tree I've got it in all of its stages of growth, so I'll be able to talk you through it. So if we look along the ground here, we see these dark green glossy ivy leaves, and they're sort of leathery and they've got beautiful veining on them like this. And as we can see, it's creeping along the ground. Now at this stage, this is what's referred to as the juvenile stage of the ivy plant. So in this stage, it produces a growth chemical, which means it seeks out shadow. Now in a woodland setting, it seeks out these shadows and follows it along so it can find itself a tree. Now once it's found its tree, we then get to its second stage of growth, which is when it reaches its adolescence. Now having found its tree, it works its way up on the bottom like this and climbs and climbs and climbs. And we see one there, that's beautiful. That's a sort of lovely adolescent ivy making its way up the tree there. But halfway through this journey, the chemical makeup of the plant changes and it starts to seek out the light. And this is when it's ready to flower and fruit. It will then flower and then produce these beautiful, dark, almost blueberry looking berries. Now the pigeons absolutely love these, so if you've got ivy in your hedge, leave these over the winter so the pigeons have got something to snack on that isn't your prize vegetable seedlings or whatever. Little tip for you there. Here we have another fantastic example of the way that ivy grows. So you see here it's creeping its way along the floor and it's glossy and sort of dark green until it finds its tree. Now once it's found its tree, it grows and grows vertically up the side of it until it reaches about this point. And here it twists its way around the tree, trying to seek out the light before giving out these branching structures with which it will flower and then fruit with these lovely ivy berries, which will then drop to the ground or be eaten by birds, and they'll germinate so it can carry on creeping its way along the forest floor. Fascinating. So this beautiful evergreen plant that you can see growing all around me on the edge of the cliff here is live oak or holm oak, or sometimes called green oak. And it's actually a highly invasive species. So this species is actually from the Mediterranean and has been naturalizing itself along the coastline here since Victorian times. In fact, just down there behind me, about 2 miles away, there is one of the biggest colonies of green oak, of holm oak, in the entirety of Northern Europe. And it really does thrive here. It produces in the autumn lots of tiny little acorns that spread with such great ease, especially with these trees up here on top of the cliff. They then drop down and colonize the entirety of the undercliff area. But it is beautiful and it is evergreen. I think the Latin name for it is Quercus ilex. So ilex is like holly. So it's just in reference to the evergreen nature of this oak tree. From a foraging point of view, it's quite interesting as well. I read somewhere that truffles can be mycorrhizal with holm oak. So far, I haven't had any luck in finding them, but that doesn't mean that they aren't here. So maybe this year will be my year. Here's a branch. They're doing some clearance up at the top for butterfly conservation. So Natural England are clearing quite a large part of the scrubland, mainly of these green oaks, in order to promote grassland for butterflies to live in. So I'm going to wrap this one up for today. It's getting incredibly windy now the mist has cleared, and I'm getting a little bit cold. And we're going to start losing the light in a minute as well, I think. I hope you enjoyed this more informal style of video. I just really wanted to get out today and explore and see what was growing and introduce you guys to the landscape as a whole rather than targeting one specific thing. But in my next video, I'm going to be digging into my book collection and showing you some excellent books for beginner foragers, so you can look forward to that. Right, it's time for me to go home. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, hit the like button and hit subscribe for more foraging videos in this beautiful landscape. Until next week, take care.